and welcome to Alaska Commercial Real Estate Today. I'm your host, Phil, and I'm joined today by Alaskan economist, commercial real estate appraiser, Lydia.
Good morning.
Hello. Well, we have got a great show today. Today we're bringing to you a national trend in commercial real estate and some Alaska news, followed up by an Ask the Appraiser question. Lydia, what do we have in national news this week?
According to BizNow, as much as $175 billion of commercial real estate globally is in distress.
Well, that doesn't sound good at all.
So this is after the second half of 2022, property values fell about 9% in the U.S.
Okay.
And commercial real estate has been directly affected by a change in use as far as people living and working differently now.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing a lot of troubled assets come out of the traditional office sector, where typically people would commute typically from another area and stay there all day and then commute back to where they live. Now all of these locations are kind of merging into this live-work kind of hybrid, and the commercial real estate is really feeling the effect of that.
Well, that's interesting. I remember a particular job in Palmer, and they were specializing in the community office outpouring. And I'm not sure if they survived the COVID downturn or not. I haven't really checked back up on that, but the model that they had was to share a receptionist, share a break room, share a kitchen, share a conference room, and then they had breakout small offices that could be all sorts of compatible uses. And that seemed like a great model. So you're saying now where we saw that on a smaller scale, we're now seeing that on a larger scale.
Yes, so that model is now in Anchorage and several areas where you can essentially rent a room on a weekly basis, daily basis maybe, and use it for your printing and whatever else you need that day, but you're not obligated to a long-term or a monthly lease essentially.
Right.
So there are some shifts that where it can happen to. In areas, we're also seeing a shift into a mixed-use type property from an office space. So in buildings where the space is more easily adaptable to another use, a lot of these buildings are going ahead and adapting it to something else, retail, especially on the first level where they can have foot traffic.
Because they can't attract that office tenant anymore.
That's correct. So they're losing tenants that leases that are coming up on renewal. Typically these tenants are either downsizing or leaving altogether, so it's leaving large vacancies.
Yep. We saw some interesting refis, and again back in the Matsu Valley, refis of spaces that were dark but still paying their leases, and you knew they weren't going to renew, and building owners were taking out money while they still could. But I remember warning some of the banks that tenants that have already gone dark, already moved out, and are just finishing their lease, you shouldn't be depending on them renewing those leases.
Correct.
And we warned several banks that this was coming and going to destabilize the properties. But in typical fashion and during boom times, they ignored the warnings and pressed on, and in some cases loaned more than the value of the building, which was interesting to see. So we'll see how that works out for them. We may be seeing some foreclosure appraisals ourselves.
Well, Bank of America has predicted about $1 billion in office property loans will have default or missed payments in 2023.
Was that just their portfolio, or that's a prediction for the larger economy as a whole?
I believe that's their portfolio, but I could be.
It could be. They hold a lot of larger.
But that's not, a loan volume, and I'm not sure what their total loan volume is, but I know it's over $1 billion. So
at this point, there's enough market evidence of 2 quarters to, at this point, undeniably say we are definitely in a downturn in the commercial real estate markets.
the indicators are there. We have yet to see, though, the sales transactions to confirm
Okay.
distressed assets, but the indicators of distress are there. The missed payments of and for loans, the pre-foreclosure
Listings,
are there.
motivated sellers,
So we're starting to see some of that. And I
price
think,
drops.
yes, the office sector especially, we will see some either discounted asking prices or complete foreclosure proceedings.
Within our own markets, we've noticed a trend in significant amounts of space wide open, available for lease, ready to be occupied immediately. Vacant, dark spaces up for lease or conversion. And I'm noticing some of those listings are being marketed fairly heavily at this point, that they're offering to make concessions, such as, covering the TIs or tenant improvements, potentially customizing space to try to attract, or as you mentioned, what we're seeing a lot of evidence of is reconfiguring to different types of use.
Yes. So the buildings that are able to be adapted are probably most likely will be. There are unfortunately some structures that adaptation would cost much more
Than raising and
yes.
starting. Yeah.
So there's going to be some instances where there's an office property that will probably go dark, potentially long term.
Yeah. Well, we had a client in our office this week that was business consulting with me and, real estate consulting with you. And some of the questions were, how can we convert these vacant, defunct space into what type of usable commercial tenants?
Yes.
And, that's a great use of an appraiser.
It is.
That's a good use of appraisers' time to come in and hire for consulting, to get opinions
Right.
on looking forward, what would be the highest and best use of the space. So they know they need to renovate. What do they renovate to? What type of tenant should they
Right.
attract? And I think he had one tenant in mind for one space. Of course, this is a large building, and he was going to specifically renovate for that tenant. What he was unsure of is, in this destabilized older building that, we'll find out whether it should be raised or not in the analysis process, but it was already destabilized. They had lost some portion. Was it
Yes.
most or many, at
I
least?
think they're about 60% occupied, which is
In a space where people in this market, which we're treading a line carefully here. I don't want to disclose a client, so I'm not going to say the area. We cover all of Alaska, so it could be anywhere. With that said, what we were looking at is that we know there's demand in that client's area, because people call our offices asking if we know of any places for the types of businesses that would potentially go in there. So we know demand's there, but they're not there because the trend that we're seeing, at least in the major markets of South Central, and you tell me if you agree for Fairbanks as well, but South Central, which is the Matsu Valley, Anchorage, Kenai Peninsula, on the road system, what we are seeing is space that is so old and almost defunct in utility that they can't attract businesses.
Yes, that's common in the Fairbanks area as well.
Okay.
It's also something we've touched on before about the average age of improvements in Alaska is getting to this point where it's potentially more economical to raise the property and construct new
What
than
I think
it is to retrofit.
Right. And I know that was one of the considerations when we moved into our headquarter office in Soldotna. We had, on top of new office furniture expenses, so we don't include that, just paint, floors, trim, we had well over $10,000 in expense to bring it up to a minimum standard, which I would consider a Class B. Would you?
Right. So especially where you're having, the carpet's dated,
We didn't even move any walls,
plumbing needs to be updated or fixed or repaired, something that's...
and we haven't even finished that.
Yeah. So even in spaces where there's little wear and tear per se,
Right.
doesn't mean that there's also a need for updating or just general maintenance. I mean,
And we didn't even accept the space until it had working doors and working light fixtures, just the basics.
right.
It was that on top of that, the facelift, if you will,
Yes.
of the space still cost us over $10,000. So,
But the good news, though, in this kind of market is the tenant has a lot of negotiation power
yeah,
to say, hey, look, you fixed up the space and I'll lease this. And especially if you're going to sign a lease that's more than a year, 3 year, 5 year, to have the owner have some skin in the game and to fix up the space to what you need.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly there's a lot more room for tenants to get into, a space where they're can have it updated with little cost to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there's indication that that's affecting residential markets as well. The residential single family, I don't know, probably multifamily as well. We do see some of the multifamily. People will pay still top market lease rates for very dated, unmaintained spaces. It'll be interesting to see with the new population figures. Did we touch on this last week? The net migration of Alaska?
I'm going to talk about that again
Oh, well,
today.
then I won't steal your thunder. So I've already
But
moved
yes,
into Alaska. Do you want to finish up any national trends that...
No, that's it. I mean, the consensus is really we're going to start to see these distressed properties be listed in the market, available. Some of these being pushed into foreclosure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still kind of this precipice where we're kind of coming out of this high boom cycle. We're going to start seeing the downturn of that.
Okay. Well, that's the national news. Let's jump into the Alaska news then, as we've already given some preview. There's a lot happening in Alaska as well. What's happening in the Alaska economy?
Well, the University of Alaska Economic Development Center has analyzed the U.S. data in relation to Alaska. And Alaska, as far as growth indicators of GDP and unemployment and net migration, fare at the very bottom of the 51. So we're 50 out of 51 in all of these indicators, 51 being the District of Columbia. But so Alaska is, in the past 6 years, had negative 8% employment growth. Just the lowest, if not the second to lowest in the country for employment growth. Our net migration as well was negative 8.8%, the lowest.
Right, and so we hear
the highest negative.
Yeah, exactly. The highest negative, the worst case.
The worst case, yes.
We know that there are states like California that have seen mass exodus of not just businesses but residents, and so let me think. New York as well.
It's New York,
Illinois,
and actually Hawaii was another net negative.
I understand
migration.
that. That makes sense. In inflationary times where tourism is impacted, which we're just rolling off of a heavy tourism impact 2-3 years, net negative migrations away from those areas does make sense. As the tourist-based industries fail, the people there have to relocate that cater to or were employed in that sector.
So can you guess the highest positive?
The highest positive?
Negative or positive net migration?
Let's hear it. Where's everybody moving to?
Yeah, where's
in a
everyone
sense?
moving?
I'm going to say Idaho.
And you're right.
Yeah.
16% growth.
Wow.
in migration. So
Even in
that's-
our heaviest years of the Matsu Valley was seeing 7 to 9. I think there was a 12 like as a quarter, but
Yeah.
we've never seen that type of sustained
Right.
growth rates.
And of course, that's over, this time span, 2015 to 2021, but it's still significant. I mean, that's
Wow.
that's where Idaho is facing the issues of housing shortages,
Mm-hmm.
as well as rapid increase in housing cost and value.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of this is not really new to Alaska. We've been kind of stuck in this same kind of situation for 7 years of having a weak or negative growth as far as GDP or employment growth.
Yes, but we haven't seen that acknowledged by the various. We've seen hints. The state offices, the entities in the Kenai Peninsula that claim to monitor these things, the entities in Anchorage, and I'm trying to be careful. I don't want to throw the names out there. If you're in these markets, you understand who those people are. They've been using numbers that were multiple years old to paint a
Right.
picture that nothing bad was happening for quite some time, at least a year and a half past when we've been saying it. While some of our bank clients have been agreeing with us when we discuss the market indicators we're seeing, the market sense or character, they agreed. At best, stagnation, most probably decline.
Yes, I think we've tried to gloss over that for far too long and been using, old numbers from years past.
And now we have numbers.
And now we even have 2020 to 2022 recovery numbers. And even now with that, they're saying Alaska's GDP growth is still negative, the worst in the country.
Yeah.
And employment growth is still negative, almost the worst in the country. And unemployment rate is still higher than the typical average U.S. So we're as far as indicators of growth go, Alaska is
Not
very,
Not.
and in some cases very negative, not.
right.
So,
Yeah, we are seeing communities downsize and lose services, and one of the economic indicators that you've always kept track of, and I hear from you repeatedly, is to watch the numbers in the public school enrollments,
Yes.
and those have been significantly impacted in every school district I'm aware of, with the exception of perhaps Galena.
Well, I mean, and that's to be fair, their numbers come from across the state.
So to be fair, for
Yeah.
those that don't know the inside scoop on that, the Galena School District houses the IDEA homeschooling offices. So anyone who enrolls in that homeschool program is registered in the community of Galena.
Right.
And at least on the Kenai Peninsula alone, the numbers were somewhere along the lines of 35 to 40% of the students during the COVID years left the school district and switched to homeschooling of one form or another.
Right.
And we've suspected, in cooperation with communicating with officials at IDEA, that likely those numbers were mirrored in other communities as well. And I believe the numbers in Anchorage were even more staggering, but we couldn't put our finger on any exact numbers.
Yeah. I've seen the numbers in Fairbanks, and Fairbanks wound up closing, I believe, 3 elementary schools.
Right.
So they've also
And not net migration there, because they actually are growing in that community due to the military and a large gold mine that continues to step up operations and is hiring rapidly.
Right. But what I'm seeing from population trends, current population from the 2020 census, and then projecting that forward, is that our younger age range of 0 to 5 has decreased year over year. So those are the children that would be moving up into school age here in the next few years. And so actually our population of school age children is still decreasing.
And some of that is generational studies, as in
It is.
the next generation is smaller in size than the previous.
Correct. It's the millennials not having the same birth rate. It's also interesting that Alaskans typically have larger families, and so when they out-migrate out of Alaska, they're taking more with them than the families coming into Alaska. Typically, the families coming into Alaska are smaller in size, so we're losing children. When we're losing population, we're losing our school-age children.
Alaska's always struggled with having to send our children outside of Alaska in order to receive proper education in the higher, post-primary schools, right? So secondary schooling and university, to get to quality or to get to the useful degrees, you had to send them outside of Alaska. And a large percentage of those children, young adults, did not return.
It's called the brain drain,
Yeah.
and it has happened in Alaska for decades.
It's unfortunate, not to throw any shade at the University of Alaska grad across the table for me, but that system has been failing Alaska for a very long time.
It has, unfortunately, and more so recently with some of the degree programs that we did have losing
Right.
accreditation.
Losing accreditation is the stake of death. So we lost Anchorage, lost nursing accreditation, lost teaching accreditation for school teachers. Did they lose their engineering program as well? I know that
I
the
believe-
strongest is in Fairbanks.
Yeah, I believe the Fairbanks is capitalized on that.
Yeah.
It goes in waves, of course, of the professors that they're able to procure. At one point, UA had in Anchorage had a very good business and economic department, and I think that's kind of fallen off as well as enrollment has declined. You know, they make cuts and they make.
Well, we know the economics grads are, top shelf, at least.
So
At least that's what we tell everybody.
it's-
So, that's a multi-tiered and multi-generational problem, which is going to take a lot to fix. And
Yes.
I'm not here to propose all the solutions, but it's good that we point out some of the problems and stop pretending like Alaska is not still caught in a recession.
Right. It's part of this analysis is also, for legislation to make decisions. And that's part of the problem they're facing is the decline in revenue. And that's nothing new. I mean, we've seen the fallout from that.
Yeah, our credit rating as a state continues to decline as the politicians in Juneau continue to pull back on agreements and go backwards on contracts and not honor,
Right.
changing the tax code every year. It scares away business. And we have chased away, not just because of what's happening in Juneau, but in the federal arena. We can't seem to get our strongest producers leases approved. And I know that Senator Sullivan has been working on that, trying to help Alaska. I don't think any of the other senators actually doing anything to help, but what we have not seen is renewal of leases or creation of new leases or even authorization to explore. And that has greatly affected our economy, and it does affect the revenues in Juneau. Although they seem unable to correlate that when they change the code every other year, that scares away business, largely because they can't secure long-term financing when we don't understand what the expenses are going to be the following year. And I think on the national scale, at least in some of the corporate income tax that I've seen from coming out of the IRS, the rules changing massively every year right now as well. It's no surprise that we see these declines, but we're not trying to be political, but the reality is the politics of taxation and the administrative fallout of not signing leases and promoting businesses does affect an economy, and Alaska's 1/3 of our economy came from that. So it's
Right.
not difficult to believe that we're failing.
Well, and as an economist, any kind of taxation that is imposed will most likely contribute to the problem and not alleviate the revenue issue. So especially when we're talking about if we're going to implement an income tax, which currently the state does not have.
But is being discussed. Personal income tax.
The net migration being what it is currently, how is that not affected?
Yeah.
It's already very difficult to operate as a business in Alaska because of the costs of internet service.
But qualified labor shortages are affecting Alaskans as well. And we just received notice in Soldotna of another business shuttering due to costs.
Rising costs, yes. And that continues to be an issue, and why we're seeing more and more corporates, businesses allowing employees to work outside of Alaska.
It is. In fact, one of our largest bank clients has their entire appraisal department no longer located in Alaska, as they are sipping Mai Tais in Arizona or someplace, from what I can tell.
And not to mention one of the very large internet providers that allows people to work from other places.
Well, because they're no longer owned by Alaskan. They sold out to a lower 48 company, so the largest telecom provider in Alaska is no longer Alaska owned. And they're partnered with Canada now. So very interesting climates. I think we should take a moment of silence and mourning for Sushi Exchange in Soldotna. I'm not sure
Definitely.
I'm very strongly considering moving our corporate office now. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to survive in this location without Sushi Exchange. I will say that the bottom line profit margin will probably increase significantly for us. So those $120 a pop sushi lunches, I guess
Will be
I don't
missed.
know. I'll have to find a new client to build those to. So,
No.
well, that's, is there more Alaskan news? That's all doom and gloom. And do you have anything
it's-
positive to say, or
I would
will
love to
everybody
have
just
something-
unsubscribe right now?
Right. I would love to say something positive here. I think the investment into infrastructure is a positive that will help boost
More federal strings attached
Yes.
infrastructure.
But yes, I think it will give a boost here. Tourism is very seasonal here. I think we're making strides to make it more year-round. That's a positive. Obviously, we're not Hawaii, so we're not going to be able to say you have the same weather anytime you come. But
Right.
you can certainly do a lot in the wintertime in Alaska. I think there's some innovative companies out there that are looking at those ways to build that. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I do know that that Alaska having one of the smallest total population of all states does dramatically affect a lot of things, and the university system problem of not being able to get a degree here and stay in Alaska, it really does hurt us.
Yeah, the reputation that the University of Alaska in Anchorage has earned through repeated losses of accreditation really is that a student choosing to enroll there doesn't know if the program they're enrolled in will still be accredited by the time they graduate. And
Right.
the history is that Alaska has left those students high and dry and said, oh, well, along with a rather large student loan bill.
Yes, and unfortunately, then you're stuck of not being able to transfer because now your
No one
credits
accepts your credits.
mean nothing. So it's a really kind of catch-22, unfortunately. And yes, a lot of money goes into these degrees for people, and to not even complete it or not have the same meaning as others, in another school.
Yes.
Is a problem. It certainly makes the decision for high school graduates really difficult.
It does. The last awards, the scholarship awards ceremony we went to in this previous year, supporting our local community, what I heard time after time after time was complete or partial full ride scholarships to state of Alaska universities, and they graciously accept that and then announce they're going somewhere else.
Right.
So you can't get the best and brightest to stay even with the offer of free.
Unfortunately, that's just not enough.
No. So Yeah, we're going to have to figure that out. Or I don't know. I guess Alaska will continue to slide down. I'm not sure there's a place to go when you're already at 51 out of 50. Where is there to go? I guess there's nowhere to go but up. So that's the good news.
I guess
You can't do much worse than you're doing already. So, but I would also like to kind of echo and maybe expand on your sentiment that small businesses in Alaska, in many ways, are flourishing, and we saw that as a business over the last 18 to 24 months. The amount of small businesses that were getting either real estate loans or acquiring businesses through other means, the amount of appraisals that we did on both sides of that was extensive in expansion of small operations, right? So small lodges, small restaurants, small campgrounds, the RV parks. I'm trying to think what other types of businesses we saw. Hotels getting revamped, old defunct spaces getting purchased and renovated.
Yes, a lot of that.
So while it's exciting, it's not happening on a super large scale for multiples of millions of dollars, right? Not hundreds of millions of dollars in a large corporate scale, but we are seeing hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions, but single millions being pumped into renovating old businesses or dead businesses into hopefully thriving businesses. And we hope they can survive. There is a market share to be had still with hard work.
There's a changing over of the guard, as you could say.
That's exactly what's happening.
The baby boomer generation is getting older and older now, and the next generation of the Gen X and millennials are kind of moving into those positions of where they're acquiring long-term assets, getting into a business that they always wanted, or starting something new, and we're seeing a lot of that changeover right now.
Well, and our hope is that people would contact a company like ours or another, competent, there's just not that many, that you're not overpaying for these spaces. Right. Because we have seen some of these deals where you're floored at what they're willing to pay because the exiting, in many cases, boomers, right?
Yes.
In the business they've run into the ground, the property that they have not maintained in a decade or more, and they're still demanding 2 to 3 times what it is worth. And when I do it from the business value side, they've been taking net losses while not maintaining for years, and somehow still think there's a positive cash flow enough that creates this large going concern value. And of course, blue sky is always blown out of proportion. It's hard to quantify, but in a lot of cases in tourism industry, blue sky is easy to quantify, or in anything that requires a permit, like the startup of a bear watch. If you don't have those contracts, future contracts, gyms that have memberships, right, moving forward, leases in place. But the tangible and intangible values, these are known things that can be found. You just have to hire the right person to do it.
Yes.
And I guess the largest ones that I see is when people hire a real estate agent to give a business value.
Salesperson.
A sales marketing expert, hopefully. Although we just saw one today that is not a member of MLS, has their own website, and what a nightmare. I honestly didn't even want to bid the job.
Well, and certainly they can't even advertise on MLS, which is a concern, in especially small markets where everybody's.
Oh my! I'm not sure we even want that job. We may have to let it go. If you hire someone who's not a part of the community or professional community that you're hiring them to be in, if they're trying to go on their own, do their own thing, go their own way, you can't market real estate without giving some basic information about the real estate they're trying to sell. The square footage of the buildings matters. the size of the property matters. The type of improvements matter. And that's pretty basic information. So I don't know how they've survived this long, but that's probably enough about that. Our point being, we are seeing positive news in small business owners turning over generationally. And our largest encouragement to people considering such a transaction is to please hire competent appraisers, whether it's business or real estate.
And a building inspector, please.
Or, in a lot of cases, a building inspector is the incorrect person. An engineer is the right person.
A cursory look of someone, yes. But I in some cases, I'd say engineers are underutilized.
Absolutely. We have found that often a structural engineer is the right person to hire. It's Alaska. We're seismically active. There's lots of structural problems in a lot of buildings. And a structural engineer is the right person, and they can also do code compliance. And what we see instead is that you hire a residential home inspector, buy their cheapest product, which is a health and safety inspection.
Well,
they check for fire extinguishers and smoke detectors. And in the cases that we have heard about, you paid the home inspector more for that product than the engineer would have charged to have done the job properly. So don't be afraid to call and ask. Just because you assume it's going to be expensive, it is not as expensive as some people think it's going to be.
And a survey, I think that's something often overlooked in Alaska because it's not a requirement.
Right.
If there's one that is existing and the buyer says, yeah, sure, we'll just accept that, you don't have to accept it.
Well, that's yet another from real life thing from this week. As one of the properties that we have contracted for you to appraise, we have discovered an adverse possession situation where an improvement has been built well onto the subject property. It's been there a really long time, and no one has bothered to get a surveyor to go out and indicate just how far the encroachment is. And you are tasked with trying to ascertain the diminished value of that property, but they still don't want to pay what's probably less than $1,000 to get the surveyor to go out and say how far it is. And I don't know if people don't understand this or not, but real estate appraisers are not surveyors.
We're not. All we can do is point out an issue and
very vaguely and generally, because if you don't have numbers, how do you even point it out?
And just a concern, right? So we had the one where it was a business value with real estate, and
their whole HVAC system was 16 feet onto the neighboring property. Their 2/3 of the parking lot was on the neighbor's property,
and it was enough of an issue that as a buyer, you should be concerned.
I was really happy that buyer hired us to do the business value and real estate value, because the real estate value was significantly impacted in that the type of business, not only one that was there and which the buyers had wanted to continue, was not a plausible business allowed in the space legally. That was a major problem, and something they didn't find out until they engaged our services. They assumed, since they'd been open and running for so long, that it was allowed and authorized. And the reality was they've just been ignoring the local, in this point it was in city limits. They've been ignoring the city statutes, they've been ignoring the state statutes, and they've been doing it for a very long time.
Yes, and that should be a red flag.
The biggest red flag to me was the temporary, what was that? It was a temporary jack holding up the entire structure in the basement. And the fact that they refused to disclose or share the engineer's report, which they had, because they hadn't actually made the repairs recommended. But it had only been like that for about 8 years,
and no one got no
one dies yet,
smushed.
No one's died yet, and I say yet because they're still operating. So that's a pending sale. I wonder why it's not closing. Weird. So, with that in mind, as we talk about adverse possession and, gosh, all kinds of things we just covered there. Why don't you give us some definitions? Did you bring your book?
I did.
Did you bring the fancy book of definitions? Fantastic. So I'll pop a picture up on the screen so people can see it. This is the latest dictionary, which, these books are expensive. What is this stupid book? $250 or something from Appraisal Institute. And they charge us $90 to ship it. Thank you, Appraisal Institute. This is the book for real estate appraisal. If you are in real estate, this is the dictionary. So believe it or not, when you Google a definition, they may or may not give you the correct answer based on their AI. The correct answer is what is in this book. And if Google gives you that, fantastic. But not always. So what are we looking at? Which one did you look up first? Diminished value, or did you look up disposition? Because if you have one of these problems, as in you can't get clients, you are destabilized, and now you have to sell because you're in trouble, that is likely going to trigger a diminished value or liquidation value.
Yes.
So why don't you throw some definitions of the appropriate terms that we've been discussing today?
Well, we are sometimes asked to do a liquidation value, and that it is a value that is based on a certain set of conditions, and the most important condition being that it is considered a short sale over a certain time period. So sometimes you'll say 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days, depending on what they're looking at. Sometimes.
So the term of liquidation is important. And
that's right.
When I speak with potential clients over the phone and developing these contracts for you to perform these services for them, one of the things that I ask them is that they need to be the ones to clearly define what the term is. And I make suggestions based on my experience in business and some of the other similar jobs we've done in the past. But the other arena that we've seen this in is actually in litigation, in which a court has mandated that a certain property be sold within a certain timeline. And if that timeline is less than the typical marketing timeline, then it is a liquidation scenario as well. And so often courts will say, sell for the price that it can sell in either 90 or 180 days. Right. So those are periods that we hear often.
Yes.
And then, I don't know, have we ever
in the
had a 30?
residential world, I would say the 30-day would be.
We have seen 30-day.
Yeah.
So we've seen that in relocation services.
Yes. Relocation
services will ask us to do a value based on you're saying 30 days.
30 days typically, yeah.
Okay.
Another one of the conditions, though, here is that the seller is under extreme compulsion to sell.
Court cases, litigation.
A
motivated seller in this case.
Yes,
so
the buyer is not. The buyer is taking advantage of this opportunity. They're not adversely motivated. So there are some conditions to this. Like you're saying, the short term, though, is the most important. The term of the you're looking at what would be the discount applied for this property to sell within 90 days.
And so without giving your trade secrets away, you just guess, right?
It's different in every market, of course.
Yes.
So in some cases, the typical marketing time is longer. A discount would be appropriate, for a shorter marketing time. But in some cases, in multifamily especially, you'll see that their marketing times are short already. And so you might not even see a discount.
In a hot market is for a certain property type.
Certain property type. So, and it depends the market, of course. But, commercial marketing times can vary widely. And in smaller communities, and they can range to up to a year. So, a discount would be necessary essentially to motivate a buyer to purchase it and, quicker and a fast, quick sale, right?
Yeah. Okay, so that's liquidation value. And everybody gets scared when it's time to calculate a liquidation value because, I mean, what are some examples of some discounts that you've applied? I mean, what sort of extreme percentages have they amounted to in some of these that we've done in the last, 12 to 18 months or so?
I'd say 50% is not unheard of.
No.
So, and that, that's a deep discount.
The one that I
course.
recall was combined with a bulk discount value in hunting for a quick sale. And it was multiple commercial properties, right, in a market. You're probably starting to remember that one. And I think we were at 30% on top of what was the bulk, another 20 or so. So that was significant. I mean, that was multiples of millions of dollars.
Yeah, it can be. Depending, again, on the area and the property. And then if it's a distressed or, troubled, being that the property needs maintenance, then
that just adds to it.
Adds to
People don't like to acquire
right.
things that have a significant amount of repairs required before they can start to operate.
Right.
That becomes, again, a large discounted value. It's not just a cost to cure at that point. It's allowing for the contingencies of things going wrong. And the fact that they can't instantly lease up has a destabilized value that directly affects the value through the income approach.
Yeah, it can. And, it's for a seller that's in a situation where they need to, move a property quickly. That's something you can address with an appraiser.
Right.
Discuss on that. A real estate agent should be able to give you some kind of pointers to that, but of course they're motivated in another way.
They are, and
So.
depending on the size of the market, for instance, one of the better commercial real estate agents or brokers in the Anchorage market would see much more of this and have numbers to draw from and might be able to use some experience to give good recommendations.
Right.
In a smaller market that doesn't perhaps have these distresses, or they're not public at least, and they don't have personal experience, say perhaps a Soldotna market, it would be really unusual to find a real estate sales agent that has enough experience to understand how to handle that situation. And it's nothing against them or their fault. It just doesn't happen as often.
Right.
So before we throw them all under the bus, use the good ones that have experience and avoid the ones that don't.
Right.
If you have a property that this is a potential for.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And not everyone's in this situation, but
not yet.
we'll start to see that more and more here.
We will.
And a lot of times where we're looking at pre-foreclosure situations, we'll be asked to do a liquidation value.
We will.
Because they do want to know what kind of discount they're looking at and recouping their costs.
Right. Yeah. That is going to happen more and more, and I'm expecting more of those phone calls. We have had some, and I'm expecting more of them. Unfortunately, it's a sign of these times. So what other terms did we discuss? Do we have some other definitions we should throw out there for our readers?
Well, similar to this is a go dark value, but that is actually, according to the dictionary, a localized term. So it's not typical or a defined definition per se, but I've seen this in big box situations where you have a tenant who has decided that their costs are too high. They're going to go dark. Essentially, they're going to shut down their operations, but they're still paying rent.
Right.
So it's a situation sometimes where what would be the the advantage of the owner at this point to sell a property where the tenant's not operating, the store is vacant, or
he's still getting his lease, but you have to be realistic about what's going to be happening soon.
right, and
in
then
order
you
to be
cannot use that
responsible.
space because it's technically occupied. I mean,
Well, it
it's-
depends on
it's
how well they wrote
essentially-
their lease.
Yes, of course, but depending on the clause, but it can be a detriment because you are sitting with something that's not operating. So, if you're comfortable with accepting rent without having a tenant in place, essentially, are you going to be okay with that? And then you have to face the turnover when that tenant does really vacate.
Right. And it may not be at the most opportune time. So you have an advantage as an owner to do something about it preemptively, to work with them, perhaps make some concessions, offer sublease. Could be you've outlawed sublease and you could maybe authorize sublease to keep them and potentially put a new tenant in place without a vacancy. And then you can, once the master lease situation is over, move into directly leasing to the new tenant that's already in place. So those are great ideas. In some places, comes to mind City of Homer and the boardwalk situations there. There are penalties in the local jurisdiction to be dark and not open for business. So on the Homer Spit, the City of Homer will penalize greatly anybody not open within the tourist season window because they expect everyone to be doing something which is approved. They do actually regulate what types of businesses and offerings can go in there as well. But we see in those contracts that the ground leases, for the most part, will be retracted if they're not up and operating by a certain date.
We've seen currently Walgreens in the Alaska market that are...
Is Walgreens gone altogether now?
They're not, but they have closed several stores.
Sports Authority was a large one here. Of course, Pier 1 Imports. Kmart in previous years. I'm trying to think some of the other ones.
Pizza Hut.
Just that our office has been a part of the appraisals for. So, Pier 1 Imports, Sports Authority, Kmart, Pizza Hut, like you said, at least two that I can think of. Did you do a Walgreens or? I don't recall.
I've not the Go Dark situation, but
we did a Home Depot. We did a Lowe's. We haven't done a U-Haul yet.
Yeah.
And we haven't done a sushi exchange. No. So, is there another definition you want to throw at our readers? Or, I mean, you've covered a lot.
I think that's, kind of...
We're going to make you have to come back.
This segues into the distressed real estate scenarios. Which, is... We are starting to see signs of in some markets here. And, of course, globally as well as nationwide in the U.S., we're starting to see signs.
We are. And, a lot of this was predicted and expected. As you said, we didn't quite have numbers in a lot of cases yet in order to accurately say how bad it actually was or might then become. And some of those numbers are happening now. And so you can expect those will affect lending rates. They affect values in the risk. So in the capitalization rates will be affected by that as well. And overall, this sort of news is significant in commercial real estate and in business value. And so there's your doom and gloom for this week, the 5th week of 2023. And hopefully next week we'll have better news. I don't know. Maybe not. You'll have to tune in to find out. And as always, we will bring more real estate and business valuation and appraisal questions and answers. If you have any questions or areas that you would specifically like us to cover on this show, feel free to send us an email at show@akcretoday.com. Thank you so much for joining us this episode, and we will see you next week.
Goodbye.